further ado, let me introduce my guest this evening, and I'm going to ask her to turn on her camera, which there she is, sitting there upon the throne. I'm delighted to say tonight's guest is Master Foster, Dame Alison Foster, DBE. Alison, a very good evening to you.
Well, good evening to you. Thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. The Wagner that we talked about, just quickly, why? Was there something recently happened in terms of Wagner, or was it just one of your favorite pieces?
I do love the Ring Cycle, and on Saturday night, Mark Havelock-Allen, my husband, and I were able to go to the first opera we have seen since the beginning of lockdown, which was a performance of the Valkyrie, which was absolutely wonderful. And I was delighted to be taken back there. Had I known you were going to hold me up to ridicule potentially for my choice of music, I would have chosen something far, far more restrained.
Most certainly not. I have several recordings of the Ring Cycle, but I can never get away from the Blackadder line from Blackadder Goes Forth about the Germans being known for their brutality. Quote, their operas last several days. Anyway, enough of that. Let's crack on with things. My research over the last little while in putting things together for this evening revealed to me online that you told the Times newspaper, and I will quote if I may, in 2014, my 3 children have been very influential. They hone my powers of argument better than any appellate court does. What did you mean by that? Expand for me a little bit, because there's obviously a funny element behind it.
Well, at the time, they were all teenagers. They were particularly independent-minded. I suppose they could be thought of as being cranky. They wouldn't listen to me unless they were cajoled into it. And they seemed to me to share a number of characteristics with perhaps judges of the administrative court in front of whom I appeared quite often in those days. And it seemed to me that if I could get them to listen to me, I could probably further my professional career to my advantage.
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting concept, comparing one's child to someone like John McGorr, one of the sort of great barbarians of the past. Do you think it stood you in good stead for appearing in front of John McGorr, perhaps even Master Chadwick, to bring in another name?
Well, yes, I've been a witness to certain tough judges of the Court of Appeal. The only thing I know about John McGorr was that he once, and this is not me, it's my husband, was so irate at a submission that counsel made. He couldn't articulate it, but he had a pencil in his hand, and his hand began to tremble in the course of the submission, and he just snapped the pencil in two, which was quite dramatic for the person making the submissions. I've been very fortunate. I've been very fortunate in not personally receiving judicial ire in my career, and it's purely a matter of chance, but I haven't. I have seen it dealt out, and it's not good to see.
Absolutely perfect timing for that story, because I just admitted your husband Mark moments before you told the story, so he is watching. And a very good evening to you, Mark. At the bar, you enjoyed a highly successful career at 39 Essex Street, and you were appointed a judge of the Queen's Bench Division 1st of October 2019. Alison, what were the biggest changes that took place in your life on transferring from a busy practice at the independent bar to sitting as a High Court judge?
Well, as I look around me, I can answer this question immediately. A smaller room, less space to put what I had accumulated over the years, which is all to the good. Perhaps most striking and very valuable was peace and quiet. As head of chambers, there was quite often a traffic to my door in the last years. Obviously, this is only the last years of my practice. And the sheer luxury of quietness to think and to write and to be on one's own as the default position was wonderful. I'm still not entirely used to it, but it's a real luxury, and I hold it precious. I think importantly, again, a luxury, not being compelled to look at things from an angle, not being compelled to be on one side, but to be able to decide is an enormous luxury. I mean, those who've sat as judges from solicitors or the bar, I think would appreciate that. I dare say academics perhaps have that distance and the luxury of expressing their views without the requirement to take it from one side of the court or the other. I enjoyed my clients very much. I've made a lot of friends and I enjoyed my colleagues, but there is something very special about being sat in the middle and not to the left or the right.
Yes. You mentioned the smaller room, and I can only apologize for that, even though I've got nothing to do with it. But let's debate, even though you now have a smaller room, is there a decent camaraderie amongst the Queen Bench Division judges? I mean, for example, if you were involved in a tricky case, is someone available nearby who you know well? You can pop into their room, have a cup of tea and talk through a tricky case. Does that camaraderie exist?
It's wonderful. It's quite unexpected and wonderful. I think we all admit to each other that we had no idea, that's to say the year with which I began, because we have quite a large cohort in my year, that we had no idea how collegiate and supportive and friendly it is. It wouldn't necessarily require propinquity, that you would down the corridor. Really, anybody, and particularly members of the Court of Appeal, make it perfectly clear that if you have an issue, a problem, subject to their availability, they're there. You couldn't ask for more.
It's very interesting, because one often thinks of life at the bar, and then many judges say when you become a judge, it becomes a lonely existence. But from what you've said, as a High Court judge, there doesn't appear to be that loneliness. Is that right?
I think that's entirely right. I say I think because I've not experienced it, but also we've been in the most extraordinary times in which human commerce has been so curtailed by our obvious COVID obligations that it's quite hard to judge normality. I had 3 months of normality, 3.5 months before we were all restricted. I, in fact, have been coming in because I live within walking distance.
Yes.
And it seemed an appropriate thing to do because there was always work to do here. But it's made a great difference to the traffic in the corridors, which is now, of course, picking up again.
Indeed.
But it's certainly never lonely. I like solitude, but that's a different thing. And there is sufficient solitude.
One of the things that I've been involved in for many years with the student members of the Inner Temple is obviously our mentoring scheme, where a barrister or bencher is allocated a BPTC student. We've talked about the camaraderie. Go one stage further. Simply, if there are people watching tonight who are thinking of applying to go on the bench, is there a similar mentoring scheme? Are you allocated, say, a Court of Appeal judge when you're appointed that is your mentor, your go-to person, or does that system not exist?
No, I have a mentor. I have a mentor from a judge of more experience but equal jurisdiction, who actually was a mate of mine at the bar. So when I was allocated to him, I went along and said, I don't believe this. You're supposed to be my mentor. What are we going to do about it? But in truth,
have they been a good mentor?
Yes, really good. And it is fortunate. There's somebody I knew, somebody to whom I could say anything because I know them, I suppose, as much as anything, and whose practice shared some characteristics with my own. But it's quite good just knowing there's an email you can ping off or a number you can call if you need to.
Yeah.
But yes, there is a system in place, and it's I'm not sure how long it's been in place. I think it's a relatively new one, but I don't know the answer to that, really.
Without wishing to talk shop, but I will, you recently gave judgment in the Greene and Betfred case, ruling in favour of Mr. Greene and providing him with his 1.7 million jackpot that he claimed was owed to him from Betfred. Now, I read a number of media reports about the case, and I obviously don't break confidentiality here, But it seemed to me that the media were treating it as though it was an open and shut case. Was the decision-making process for you as the judge as straightforward as those media reports made out?
No, of course not. No, of course not. It was very well and carefully defended. In fact, there were a number of preliminary issues because it was a summary judgment claim. So the initial question, was it suitable for CPL 24 or not? Was it a summary judgment or strikeout? Or would I have to hear a plethora of evidence at some later stage? That had to be determined. There were changes to the manner in which the claimant put his case. I did not agree, in fact, with the claimant's analysis of how his rights arose, as is reflected in the judgment. And I obviously canvassed that with him. So there were issues then of amendment and whether an amendment ought properly to be allowed, and indeed what the issues were, what the four corners of the issues were. And there was no agreement between the parties, save that there were some arguably operative exclusion clauses. And there were three layers of contractual documentation, each containing a slightly different exclusion clause, each of which Betfred said they were entitled to rely upon. So it was, the texture of it was relatively complex. They were standard contractual principles, which I applied. There was nothing special about it. Context was perhaps special. There's not a lot on gambling and how contracts for gambling are made, certainly not of this sort of nature. It was an education for me on online gambling, and certainly the source of some of the contractual documentation was interesting because some of it was licensing taken straight out of IT licensing. So it was beneath the surface quite complicated, and there were lots of things that required decision and lots of interesting points I could have decided but didn't need to, given the scope of the issues between the parties. No, I mean, yes, if you read the reports, it was absolutely obvious, wasn't it? How could it have taken as many pages to decide as it did?
But I suppose just a brief supplementary on that. In my early days as an advocacy trainer, we had a summary judgment exercise that I think, and in fact, I see he's with us tonight, Master Toby Hooper may even remember teaching this exercise to me when I was a pupil. But I have a feeling we had a summary judgment exercise that was based on the old Gaming Act of either 1870 or 1890, where you could not sue on a betting contract, but the dynamic presumably now has all changed.
Oh, it's all different, yes, and you can, and it's statutorily possible. And yeah, that was not an issue. That was one of the few things that was not an issue.
The parties were actually agreed there was jurisdiction for the claim.
That was not being argued. You know, what had been agreed, of course, took up rather longer to explain. Yes.
Yeah. For the benefit of some of our viewers and listeners in due course who might be maybe at the junior end, or even for those at the senior end, since you took up your appointment and now in your capacity as judge, give me, I suppose, the three main things that counsel often do or maybe don't do when appearing in front of you that cheeses you off a little bit. Spill the beans. What irks you when you're sitting on the bench?
What, only three?
All right, well, Master H meets, I should say, Alison, that this concept is only designed to last half an hour. If you want to do a supplemental episode, I'm sure Greg Dorey could give permission for maybe like a Wagner opera. We could do a series just with you. But no, just the three main ones, if you would.
Right. Something that counsel often don't do in a way that I think is clear is explain what the issues are. Is stand up and say, my case is about this, this, and this. You've got to decide that, that, and that. So right, thank you. You can quite often start with an intriguing story, but as the court, you want to know, what am I being asked to do? Yeah. What do you need me to decide? So if you've got a little paragraph on that up front, I think that's very good. Number two, don't underestimate how long it takes to read something properly. if you've got a detailed case and you want it properly read, so it doesn't have to be reread again, allow enough time. I mean, we all did it at the bar, which is to say, oh, it's a 2-day case. And it isn't, it's a 4-day case, but you know you'll get on next month if you say it's a 2-day case, whereas you'll be down the line. So I think there is an understandable tendency to underestimate. You think, this happens in certain jurisdictions and not others, and I'm generally protected from it, but it does surprise me sometimes that counsel don't argue their case. They don't advocate. There can be a tendency, it may be a junior thing, or in, say, certain jurisdictions, you stand up, got the skeleton argument, and everyone puts everything in writing at least once these days. So you've got the skeleton argument, you've got the documents, and there can be a tendency to sort of stand up there and say, right, over to you, rather than, this is my case, you'll find this here, you'll find that there. And I think advocate, certainly when I was a pupil, there was far less confined to paper. Sometimes there weren't skeleton arguments, it didn't matter terribly if there weren't, and there certainly were not screeds and screeds of statement of case on paper. So you actually had to say, and necessarily therefore trim your argument to its essentials, which is quite a good exercise. And I think if actually the junior bar just advocates, says, this is my case, these are the reasons, start with the propositions. I make these propositions, they're supported by boom, 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 and I'll show you where they're supported. So
it is interesting you say that, because flying the flag of Inner Temple, I can assure you that that is not what we are teaching our pupils and new practitioners on the various advocacy courses. Those responsible for such submissions, if I can call them those, are clearly from other inns, because they're certainly not used.
I'm sure that's right.
You mentioned skeleton arguments there. Are they still too long?
Well, they're pretty fat skeletons. It depends. It depends on the issues. There's no one thing. Almost all counsel all the time try their absolute best. I'm very conscious of that. Time is short, clients are difficult. One of the great things about having been at the bar is you do know what it's like to have your solicitor tugging your gown, metaphorically, if not actually, and the pressure of time, the difficulty of witnesses, that helps.
Yeah. Let's move away from judicial life now and come to the Inner Temple. And of course, I gaze out of my window here at 3 Kings Bench Walk and see that half of the scaffolding has been removed from the top of the building today. Much progress has taken place, and very soon we'll be back in there. One of your roles for the inn is Master of the Pictures, I noticed from my archives. What does that involve? Is it fun? Tell us about it.
It's completely wonderful, and it involves quite a wide range of obligations. They've been somewhat on hold whilst we're making the great refurbishment, but not entirely. One of the most exciting was going to see the stone Pegasus refurbed, brought back to life.
Yes.
But on a perhaps more general and mundane level, it's acquisitions. Quite often characters from the Inner Temple come up in auction, and we'll receive a recommendation that we might want to leave a bid on so and so and so and so, and the decision is made there, always in discussion, but those are quite fun to make. Hanging decisions, they certainly were and still obviously will be dictated by the size of the picture and the size of the wall space, and there are a lot of folk too big to go other than where they hang. But for me, the most exciting thing is when there's a commission. It can sometimes be an exercise in diplomacy, because those involved, whether as sitter or perhaps the engine behind a new commission, get very engaged. And it's quite difficult to know at what stage, or if at all, a picture of somebody should be commissioned, of whom and by whom. But interviewing artists with a view to engaging one of them for a particular commission, I think I've found the most exciting part of it, certainly the most responsible. Yes, as I say, it can be an element, there can be an element of negotiation with those who have an interest. And certainly in the course of the work, there's discussion with the artists themselves. And it's a great privilege to be as close to something like that as I am, obviously, with assistants.
I suppose, and I'm not sure it's the case, it may be a matter for Henrietta more than yourself, but obviously when the new building is complete, there will be fresh and new wall space. Will you, as master of the pictures, be involved in deciding whether new pieces are to be commissioned for those areas, or will that be done mainly internally?
I always do what Henrietta tells me. I think that's always...
That is very wise. I should add, from my own perspective, that is an incredibly wise answer.
There is new space, and there is discussions of which I am a part quite properly. There is a committee that is discussing it, and there's been a very robust process of tenders and discussion, and some engaged discussion with differences of view, working out a way. And we've got to a point now where there's some really exciting things in the pipeline. I mean, really exciting. The use of the modern space, particularly, and how that's going to be married to our old heritage and representations of some of our most precious documents, so that they are made visually accessible to all. That's very exciting, but there's absolutely no credit to me for that. This has been coordinated by Henrietta, but the feed-in is from a committee and experts.
Don't answer this question if you don't want to, because it's just occurred to me arising out of something you said. Whatever happened to the large picture of Master Faulkner that was replaced by the slimline Master Faulkner? Does it still exist, or was it given to Master Mariana Hilliard as a gift of years gone by?
You're going to have to ask Lady Faulkner that. My information suggests that there was more than a slight influence from the House of Faulkner as to what was or was not displayed in that space.
Yes. Well, moving on. Obviously, you and I have worked together for some years, you being Master of the Staff and me being the Assistant Master of the Staff. What's the most rewarding part of that role that you carry out for the Inn?
Oh, the staff themselves, undoubtedly the staff themselves. I'm not sure we all realise how extraordinarily lucky we are in Inner Temple. I hesitate to say compared to other inns, but I will say it, by the character and the devotion of the people who work for us. And I find it uplifting. There are difficulties from time to time, of course there are, but there's something about the Inner Temple that does seem to inspire considerable loyalty, and I have gained great pleasure from being involved. I should say that really you're the Master of the Staff, because I asked for somebody who knew about employment law. They asked me who knew nothing about employment law in those days. Could I have someone? And I was really lucky to be given you as my quotes deputy who knows about employment law. And that has been a great boon, actually. It's been a huge boon at the Inn. And I think, I am touching wood here, I think that we keep a fairly happy ship. I say we, I mean Greg and everybody else, but it's a privilege really to be involved. And also, as you know, I am available, the staff know I am if they need a private word, and that has happened, and it's entirely confidential. There's something you need to thresh out on that level, then there is somebody they can talk to, who's not the guy in the next office, as it were.
Yes. Master of the Pictures, Executive Committee, Master of the Staff. Is there any area of the Inn or any committee that you haven't served on that you would like to serve on? Apart from wine, we would all say wine, but Master Solly, I'm afraid, has that tied up ad infinitum. But any particular areas that you still crave to maybe be involved in? Or would Mark say, no, she does enough already, let's cease this conversation?
Well, I think he and I might have to come to fisticuffs over this, because I was a very pretentious teenager, and I did a very odd degree. I ended up being a sort of medieval linguist, and I stopped. I didn't do Chaucer, he was too modern for me. I did medieval Latin and Anglo-Norman and all these weird things. And my research degree was in a 9th century gospel book.
Right.
In the Bodleian. So I spent a lot of time in beautiful libraries, quietly, And part of me really longs to be on the archive committee. I have nothing that I could give to them. I know nothing or not nearly enough about what we hold, but I can't think
Alison, I should say, I don't know whether you're on gallery view, but Greg Dorey, the sub-treasurer, has just produced his black book and made a note of that. So.
Oh, well, when there's a coup and they kick me out for my picture choices and my harassment of everybody else, then think of me for that. But Mark has served on it with distinction, and it's much in demand as a committee. I'm very conscious of that, but I can't think of anything better. Really interesting.
One of my prized possessions that I have is a book entitled Disciplinary and Regulatory Proceedings. Might sound familiar to you. I think it's now in its 10th edition. I use it as my reference tool for when I do regulatory work at the Teacher Regulation Agency, acting for teachers. But I think you've been involved in that text since its inception. Was there anything in particular that inspired you or prompted you, Gregory and Seema, to put together such a text for regulatory proceedings?
Well, yeah, Greg Treverton-Jones prompted us, knocking on the door and saying, "I think we should do this." It was edited by Harris for many years, who just had to retire, and we were conscious that there in fact wasn't a general book. There are some extremely good books. I mean, the Sisters book is written by Greg Treverton-Jones. And we thought there was a little bit of a gap in the market. It's difficult because it's general as opposed to one profession, but it tried to draw the threads together about regulatory laws, and that's how we came to do it. And it does seem to an extent to fill a need, but they're always changing their structures all the time, so it's hard to keep up to date.
Yeah, and a new edition potentially out in the next few years?
I think so. I think so, yeah.
Finally, let's move away from professional life. Again, Mark is on the line, and I'm sure he may want to get involved in this, but he can't because he's muted and he can't. But away from professional life, what about the Alison at home? What hobbies? We obviously know you like the ring cycle, but what other hobbies take up your free time? What do you like doing away from the law?
I like to paint. I came within a hair's breadth of going to art school.
Wow.
My parents were art teachers. That was sort of, I thought I would do that. But then I went off the rails and became a barrister. So, I like to get back to that.
We paint while listening to Wagner.
I'm not sure about that. I haven't tried that, in fact. No, but that is what I like to do. And I'm very fond of old roses, the Bourbon roses, and the very simple Chinese ones. So I try and grow a number of different, some of them quite difficult roses. And they're out for maybe 2 weeks in the year, and I quite often miss them. But that's what I like to do if I'm not doing this.
How wonderful. Well, Alison, I see that my timepiece ticks to the hour of 7. That is it for another edition of Master H Meets. Thank you to everyone online for coming. Thank you especially to Master Foster, my guest tonight, for providing such insight into a number of things. The next Master H Meets will be on the 12th of July 2021, and it will be the last before we take a short break for the summer. We will be returning in the autumn when we are hoping to broadcast face-to-face in our new lecture theatre facility, as well as live streaming at the same time. My guest in July will be Master Tunde Okawale, MBE. This has been, as always, a Revels production for the Honourable Society of the Inner Temple. Executive producer Henrietta Amodio, produced by Kate Peters and Paul Clark. As always, my name is Alastair Hodge, aka Master H, saying good night, and thank you, Alison. Good night.
You're very welcome.